Okay, so here is what we are planning to cover today. We'll do just kind of an overview. What is strategy in a nonprofit context? What do we do in terms of strategic planning? Like, how do we actually get there? And then what does generative governance look like? How do we go from taking that strategy to allowing us to have really adaptive conversations as a board? We'll talk about some shared leadership, and then we'll wrap with some case studies. As we said, especially since we've had a couple of folks join, if you have questions, things you'd like to add to the conversation at any point, please drop them in the chat, come off mute, whatever works best for you so that we can make sure we really make this relevant for your experiences. Oh, and Mary, so great to hear that you're with Boulder Day Nursery. Oh, I love the work happening there. Thanks so much for sharing. Okay, so I'm going to start us off talking about strategy and planning. How many of you have been part of some sort of strategic planning process? Most, right? Yeah. They can be good, they can be bad, they can be somewhere in the middle. And we often think about strategic planning in this kind of context, like preparing to panic. What is the big scary thing that's happening or that could happen to us in the future? When strategic planning is done really well, though, we're able to focus in the work we're doing. We're avoiding, the bright, shiny object syndrome, the jumping after every opportunity that we think could help expand our mission or the work we're doing. And it helps us really build to the future that we want by casting a vision of where we're hoping to go and how our organization fits into that. We can really make sure that we're continuing on that path. Because any of you who have operated without a strategy probably know that without that guide map and understanding of benchmarks, it's easy to fall off the path. For any of you who have worked in nonprofits, you've experienced that, right? We put our heads down, we just get to the work that needs to happen today. And sometimes we forget that larger zoom out. A strategic plan helps us do that because it's this constant reminder of where we're going, what we're really driving towards. It also gives us an opportunity to take a step back and really understand our organization and the environment within which we operate. What's happening outside of our day-to-day work that could impact us. It's also a really great opportunity to hear from the folks that we're serving directly, those individuals, those community organizations, so that what we're doing is always informed by those end users, by the outcomes we're hoping to see. And it also helps us ensure that we've really got buy-in across the organization. By developing a strategic plan together, it means that we all know where we're heading and we're all going to get there together. So when we really break it down, here's some of the things we're thinking about when we're trying to understand our organization and the environment. It's, yes, what difference are we truly making? Not what difference do we want to make, but what difference are we truly making? How does our programming, our services actually make a change? And is that the change we're hoping it will make? What are the trends that we're seeing? If anybody had a strategic plan going into 2020, you probably had to take a minute and step back and understand that the entire world was shifted upside down. Now, as we're strategic planning, we're thinking about, okay, what trends came out of that? What did we learn about the philanthropic sector and how it responds in a global emergency? How does our community receive that kind of shifting change in needs, and how do they step up? And we're also thinking about what is changing in our space or likely to change. Actually, just last week, we were working with an early childhood organization. For those of you in those early childhood spaces, you're always dealing with new regulations, new standards. And so they're working through how do we integrate that and have an organization that's really agile and prepared to step into that space. Hearing from those we work with is so critically important. Again, this is how we make sure that we are always serving the mission we intend to serve, and not just doing things the way it's always been done. So when we hear directly from those we work with and hearing what they need, how well our organization is or is not meeting them, then we can also shift and make sure that we're improving constantly. It also gives us a sense to understand, how are we perceived out in the world? Is it good, bad, or otherwise? Is there something we need to do around our reputation or even just marketing and messaging so people know what's really happening? Have we heard from our volunteers and donors? And we want to ask them those same questions. And our partner organizations, who are we collaborating with? What do they think about what we're doing? Could we work with them better? And then, like I said, that organizational wide buy-in is so critical. When you've got your staff, your board, everybody working together and understanding where our strengths are, where our deficits are, how we're going to meet the community needs, and where we're going, it gets really exciting. If you have that truly driven, transformative strategic plan at the end of it, there should be applause. There should be popping champagne and balloons, because it feels so exciting to think about the work that can be done with the strategic roadmap that you've put in place. But of course, that's all pretty high level stuff. And my picture is not going to load. So you'll just have to trust me that it's a really great picture. Let's talk about what it actually looks like. How do we develop this strategic plan? So this is the general process that we see. Some of you might have been in strategic planning where it is just showing up in one day, doing a retreat, coming out with some strategic goals. This process can take shape in that. Ideally, though, it is a broader perspective, because again, we want to hear from others outside of our organization. We really want that, third party perspective. So we start with our planning to plan, understanding our context, agreeing on the purpose and direction of the organization, then shifting from that vision to action, and then being able to monitor progress. But I'm going to break it down for you further, I promise. So when we plan to plan, we start asking, what is this going to look like? What's our timeline? Who are we involving when? What information are we really gathering and reviewing? So when we do strategic planning, for instance, we often have some sort of interview session, where we're reaching out to donors, service users, community partners, and having a pretty deep conversation with them about their perceptions. We're probably doing some sort of surveying that can go even wider than the interviews. We might also be looking at external data, right? Wanting to understand our context. So planning to plan, make sure that we're thinking through all of those pieces, who's doing what and by what timeline. We also want to start off by just understanding, what do we already understand? Maybe we just did a pretty significant survey. Let's bring that into this space. And what lines of inquiry do we have? What are we really curious about as an organization? What theories do we want to test out? If you're thinking about adding in a new program, what would be helpful to know about that proposal in a strategic planning context? So while we're planning to plan, we're really thinking about what we need to get to that eventual plan that can really be, again, transformative. When we're understanding the context, this is, again, we're looking at the internal and the external forces. So I'm sure many of you have done like that traditional SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Your strengths and weaknesses are kind of that internal stuff. Strengths, your staff is adored, your team works well together. Weaknesses, maybe you have really bad data retention processes. So that's that internal look. Then you've got the external with the opportunities and threats. Opportunities could be what funding is coming down the pike. Where is there opportunities for program expansion? And threats can be really local, micro, and very macro. Like there's economic uncertainty in an election year. That's something that most of our clients are dealing with right now. We don't know what year-end giving is going to look like in 2024 after an election, because political giving always impacts philanthropy to nonprofits. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about all of that as we're going into strategic planning. And like I said, we're collecting this data in a number of ways. Sometimes it is much more research oriented, right? We're looking for data, we're getting feedback. Sometimes it can just be discussion. Your executive directors or chief executives are really plugged in to the work. They're doing it all day, every day. So it's looking at, what are they seeing and hearing? What kind of conversations are they hearing with other executive directors? We also want to make sure that we're looking at a number of different types of data. So yes, your program data and evaluation. Are you serving more kids, fewer kids? Are you having the same outcomes you did 5 years ago? Are they improving? You want to look at your fundraising data. And this is an important thing. It's not just financial data. Yes, you want the financial data, right? Are we raising more money? Are our expenses in line? But your fundraising data looks even deeper than that. Are you retaining donors from year to year? Are your donors upgrading, meaning they give more this year than they gave last year? that fundraising data can really help because your fundraising strategy, of course, has to be in service to your larger strategic plan. And if you haven't really analyzed what's happening in your fundraising context, you could miss out there. You want to look at demographics, right? Are we really representative? Do we have the right voices in all of these different roles? Again, we want to always elevate participant voices, making sure that those end users, whoever we're actually working with, that their voice is part of it. For those of you serving youth and programs focused on children, there are ways to even get them involved, right? Have a focus group with your Boy Scout troop and ask them about some of the concepts you're playing with. Make sure that they've got a voice in some of these pieces. And then, like I mentioned, surveys, donor surveys, volunteers, staff, board. We want all the feedback. Then when we get to agreeing on purpose and direction, often in a strategic planning process, we're going to take a step back and make sure our mission, vision, and values still make sense. They're still relevant. What I think we see probably most commonly is that when mission statements are developed, they can sometimes be too specific. And so a mission statement that was developed 20 years ago might not actually fit with the reality of your service provision today in 2024. So taking a step back, making sure that it still resonates, that it still makes sense, and that that vision is still that exciting end goal that you have ultimately for the work of the organization. And then making sure everybody's in alignment. Sometimes we review mission, vision, values, and we decide that, yeah, they are spot on, but we want to make sure that we've asked everybody about that before we move forward. We also want to make sure that those statements, the mission, vision, values, are really integrated. Have we made sure that our values about inclusion are showing up in our fundraising work? How are we making sure that our values around responsibility are part of our board meetings? So part of your strategic planning process can be just a quick review of how are we living these things out that we just agreed are relevant to us. Then we go from that big vision, those big ideas, we take all of that feedback and we put it into action, right? We come up with some focus areas, strategic priorities. Those words are kind of used interchangeably. But what are we going to do in the next time frame that's going to get us closer to that vision? We want to make sure that, of course, these are achievable. So we're looking at our current infrastructure. What can we do in the time frame given? And when I say the time frame given, most nonprofits are typically doing about 3-year strategic plans. Some are doing 5 or a little bit longer. It also is about how volatile the space you're operating in is. If you're one of those legacy organizations that you're doing the same work in generalities that you were doing 10 or 20 years ago, you can do a larger strategic plan. If you're in a space like, say, immigrant rights, where you're constantly addressing legislative changes and how that work happens, you're going to want a nearer term strategic plan just because you're not going to be able to predict so many different variables going into the future. So that infrastructure review is with the overlay of the time frame. A 5-year strategic plan, of course, gets you a lot more time to get all the things done than a 3-year or even a 2-year would. And then we're coming up with really specific goals and strategies, things we can measure, things that at the end of that strategic plan, we can say, yes, we absolutely did that, or no, we didn't, and here's why. And it's important that we can have those discussions in either direction. And then, of course, monitoring. Strategic planning should be an ongoing process. Just because we've adopted a strategic plan, we've decided here are our priorities, here we're going over the next 3 years, doesn't mean that things can't change. Again, if you were in the middle of a 3-year strategic plan when COVID hit, you better be pulling out that strategic plan and figuring out how are you going to address the current realities. And this is a really important point for boards, because that's where you can come in that review and ensuring that adjustments are made when they need to be made. Before I jump into this next part, I'm just going to pause and see what questions or thoughts you have on the strategic planning process itself. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. You mentioned at the beginning the need to review or start the strategic planning process by reviewing the mission and vision and values of the organization. So that's something that you should review every year when you meet with your board. Or is there a best practice? How often do you review your mission and vision?
Usually every time you do strategic planning, but if you're doing it in a longer term way, so every 3 to 5 years, say, if you're reviewing it every year and potentially making changes, that can actually be pretty unsettling to the organization because you want it to be able to speak to the work you're doing today as well as next year without needing a change. Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, I see some questions going into the chat, so we'll be patient for those to come in. Would also love to hear from any of you if you've gone through strategic planning recently and if this process resonates or if you went through a different process yourselves.
So this is Christine. And Nia knows we went through the strategic planning process last year. And it was great to have Nia specifically, in addition, somebody outside of the board to facilitate so that we could be fully engaged. The one thing that I would share is that, interesting enough, part of our strategic plan was to hire an executive director because we had never had an executive director for Colorado Women's Education Foundation. So what I'm finding now is that we actually achieved that part of our strategy plan is we've hired an ED. She's been with us for less than, I think, 2 months. And it does beg the question if we now need to rethink and review the strategic plan because that's a powerhouse resource that we've never had. So I'm sure we'll be reaching out.
Oh, thank you, Christine.
Looks like, yeah. So what I would share is as you create your strategic plan and actually some of those elements come to fruition, it will guide you to rethink what your strategy is. So it might be a 1 to 3 year strategy, but if you are achieving some of that, it's time to rethink it.
Absolutely. That is such a great example too of when revisiting your plan really makes sense. Because when you developed that plan, it was with your current reality and constraints of capacity really in mind. And I don't even remember, the timeline we had in there for the executive director. But yeah, now you've got such a resource that it can actually allow you to do a lot more. And so great opportunity to review, look at the other goals and maybe the things that didn't quite make it as a goal, but were discussed that could come online this time around. Great example of why those reviews are important. And Gretchen, I'm so glad to hear that Boy Scouts of America has the kids involved, right? Like that youth voice
they have
is
to.
so amazing.
Yeah, they
I
have
wanted
to.
bring up one more thing that Christine, the idea of a neutral third party helping to facilitate and guide the strategic planning process. And I'm biased because I am a consultant, but I do want to put in the plug for finding a consultant that does fit with your organization's values, just because then everybody gets to fully participate and you have this person that is able to do all of those surveys and interviews and those outside pieces with folks and be seen as a neutral party. So you get more honest feedback in your process as well. And just to have somebody there to help herd cats, help get everything organized, and then get you moving on to the next steps is so valuable. And I know a lot of times newer nonprofits or nonprofits that are smaller will often be like, well, we need to save money on this part. So-and-so will just facilitate. And it usually doesn't end up going as well as it could.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, so I'm involved with 2 quite different HOAs, and the mission of one HOA is never to do maintenance, which means things often fail and many fail at the same time. So they're penny wise and pound foolish. The other HOA is safety conscious and proactive, but both HOAs actually have controlled and had the old guard. And so they've had control of the boards for 40 or 50 years. And even though people wanted to join, they didn't let them join. So they have not mentored people to come up. And so now it's like, the last minute, and they want me to be president. And, I've owned there for 29 years, but, they never had committees or let me be on the board or, this kind of thing. And so they're in trouble, and then, there's a meeting tonight actually, but my favorite children's book is called What If Everybody Did? And so, between the last meeting and tonight, we got a request for a block party, and they wanted to do some kind of solicitation, and they wanted to serve food, and there's 180 units, which is, it's not huge, but they want to take up parking spaces and they want to play music. And, what if all 180 units, which is more than 180 people, want to do the same thing? What if they want to do it for the Boulder? I mean, how are we going to control that? What if people come with allergies? They wanted to serve ice cream. What if somebody wants to serve beer? They can't do that. It's like, how do we? We can so easily. We don't. Well, it takes too much time. We can't be in the business of that. The answer should just be no. But because we have the only members that stepped up, and a lot of them, they want to entertain all of that, and we just can't do it. It puts us in a very vulnerable place and takes a lot of our time, and people want to park, and some people work at night, and they want to sleep during the day, and they don't want music, and we just can't be in that business. So
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
That sounds like a fun challenge.
I'm taking my children's book tonight.
I think that's a great idea. Yes. I wrote that down. I'm going to look that up.
Oh, it's great. It's hard to find. I'll let you know.
Thanks. But Gretchen, you really you've teed us up very well for our next piece, which is, once you have a strategy, how do you use it to actually help make decisions and streamline that process? Because you're right. If you take every meeting relitigating these decisions, because folks just want to have those conversations, it's going to bog down your board meetings. So for boards who are doing this work, what often comes out of a strategic plan is some sort of strategy screen. So this allows your board and even your staff before your board, especially if you're a larger organization, to start screening through some key questions before a decision comes forward. So this means that then we can also have a little bit more agility, right? We've developed some questions that help us make decisions as interim opportunities come up, for instance. Here's some examples of how this is a pretty, high level example of a strategy screen. Ideally, it would be, much more specific to the strategic plan, but I just want to give you a sense of what this looks like. So talking about the vision. How does this opportunity, this thing that we're thinking about, how does it help us meet the vision, our mission? How does it fit within our strategic priorities and impact what we want to do? That's a really important thing, because sometimes opportunities might fit within our strategic priorities. It's still in the service of one of those, but because of the resources needed, but because of how it's going to draw away, it might mean that we can't achieve one of our other strategic priorities. So we want to look at both the positive impacts and negative impacts. We want to look at, is this a need? So when we're doing strategic planning and we're looking at the landscape in that environment, was this a need that was identified? And is our organization uniquely positioned to meet it? One of the classic examples that I like to give is, you're part of an organization that serves homelessness. Whether it's homeless individuals, providing case management, sheltering, but whatever, you're providing services to unhoused folks. Somebody comes to you offering a program around a health clinic. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, our folks need that, right? Unhoused people need help, access to healthcare, but are we the organization to provide that? Or are we better suited to find a healthcare provider that we can partner with instead of us providing those services directly? So we're always thinking about, why us? Are we uniquely positioned? Do we have the resources? Do we have the capacity? And does this meet our larger strategic needs? We're also thinking about, how are we measuring success? How do we know that this is going to be something that does those things? And how and when are we evaluating that? So do we have go, no-go points in this decision? This can obviously be used for really big decisions we're making, adding on a program or service area, purchasing something really significant. But it can be even done for smaller things, like you're thinking about adding a new position to your team. And as a board, you're thinking about the budget implications. So a strategy screen helps you think through all those component pieces, and always looking at that overlay of your strategic plan that has been adopted. For some of our clients, actually, they'll even utilize this in advance of board meetings and say, the staff member that's leading this project, can you fill this out and bring it to the board so that we can see how you're thinking through the strategy screen and making sure that everything's in alignment for us. The biggest issue we see with strategic plans is that they become dusty. They get left on a shelf, they get forgotten about, and they get dusty. So how do we avoid that? The first thing is actually just an accountability measure. Tell the community about it. This is also so great in terms of developing relationships with the community, stewarding your donors, bringing in more volunteers. So once you've developed a strategic plan, make sure you've got a strategic communications plan for that. How are you sharing out that this plan has been adopted and you have this vision and goals for the next 3 years? You want to make sure it's integrated everywhere. So board, if you have a work plan, a month by month of the work you're doing, have you thought about it in the context of your strategic plan? Are your strategic plans buckets or priority areas actually driving your agendas potentially? How is this part of your messaging? At your annual event, are you talking about your strategic priorities? Make sure that you're always also providing regular updates and having opportunities for discussion. You want to celebrate those wins. So when you've hit one of your goals and objectives, talk about it. Talk about it at the board, talk about it at staff meetings, make sure that you're really integrating it everywhere. When we're thinking about roles in strategic planning, I know a lot of you are representing boards. It's also important to think about what is your role as a board member versus what staff member roles could be, or even a task force. We do often see some sort of committee or task force coming together around strategic planning. This can just make sure that you've got a group that's dedicated to making sure that that plan to plan, that initial process you went to, actually comes to fruition. It also makes sure you've got enough representation of different voices in the room. And sometimes these task forces or committees are just for the duration of planning. Sometimes they continue afterwards to help monitor and make adjustments. Yeah, we worked with a client recently. We had a 9-month strategic planning process. At the end of that, the committee liked themselves so much that they wanted to keep meeting and just being able to have those big conversations about the organization. So they became an ongoing committee. As a board, you're ultimately going to approve the strategic direction. So what are those big categories, the goals that you've set forth, and making sure that they align with the vision? You're going to be monitoring progress, making sure that it's actually being implemented and moving you in the right direction. You're going to help determine when updates are needed. Of course, you've got staff that are going to be a big part of that, but you've realized, gosh, we hired an executive director, which was a big goal, and now we have a lot more capacity. That's a good time to start working on those updates. And as board members, you might even have some specific areas to tackle, improving governance, increasing board development, increasing diversity on the board. All of those can be part of your strategic plan. So you're also looking at the work you have to do just to accomplish the strategic plan, much less the broader monitoring of it. And then if you have staff, which about half of your organizations, I believe, do, they're going to be primarily responsible for implementing. They're taking that plan and putting it down into the day-to-day operations of the organization. They're, of course, absolutely monitoring. They're providing updates back at that higher level about what's happening. And they're also going to help alert the board if there are strategic changes that need to be made. Major legislation just came down and that's going to impact your organization. And so you need to be thinking about it. They can be there to help be that conduit to the board to make sure that the changes are made as needed.
All right, before we move into the next section, I do just want to give pause and see if there were any additional thoughts or questions or comments around the strategic planning process specifically. just give that a minute. We can come back to it later too. It's not done after we move on, but. Oh, there's the children's book in the chat. Love it.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I didn't become my favorite children's book until I was an adult and found it.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Great. Okay, well, you all can to bring it up anytime if it pops in your head, bring it up. So we're going to shift a little bit into generative governance, and I just want to set a little bit of context about how these two are related, because during the strategic planning process, we're going through this very deep dive of engagement, and we're going through deep partnerships with community, with board members, with donors, with staff, like everybody is involved, right? And then we move back into our regular business as usual board meetings, and you can just feel the stark difference between the two. It almost feels like it gets dropped, even with monitoring on the strategic plan. Feels like a disconnect between the way that meetings and boards are typically set up to this whole beautiful strategic planning process that we just went through. So generative governance is a way to think about approaching our board meetings a little differently. So we're going to move beyond our routine tasks. We're going to focus on the agility. We're going to focus on that big vision still. That doesn't mean we're changing our mission, vision, values, but we're going to have more time and space with a generative governance model to explore these discussions, to have deeper dives on it, and to come to these meetings really prepared to have these conversations. So it's not trying to catch up somebody who maybe didn't read the board packet, right? Like everybody comes prepared and you're able to have a real discourse. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but you have the time and space to have these conversations. If somebody disagrees, let's dive more into this. And it's a way to have that carry through with the strategic planning process, and also the carry through with those relationships that were built. Maybe they were strengthened or just established in the strategic planning process. So how is community continuing to be carried through in your generative governance model? How are board and staff continuing to partner? I've been a part of organizations where the staff wasn't even invited to the board meeting. So how do we continue to strengthen these relationships and carry that through so we're always continually connected to that larger mission, vision, values, and to the community? What's going on in the community? What are the current needs and opportunities? How have those shifted perhaps since our last strategic planning process? And then with the generative governance model, you don't have to have these two types of leadership models, but they really complement each other. With a shared leadership, and that's that there's more than one executive role in an organization, or a distributed leadership model where there is one executive director, but the decision-making is pushed out to other levels. And when you start to have that shift with the governance at the board level, these two just start to make sense, again, to complement each other and the goals that you have.
So when we're talking about generative governance, it is kind of this building process, what we see with like really high performing boards. So hopefully all boards are providing fiduciary oversight. Like that's your legal requirement, right? You're looking at the financials, you're reviewing and approving budgets, you're looking at transparency and risk management. You are providing oversight. Now, from there, we're seeing strategic oversight. So setting that direction and goals, really being engaged in the strategic planning process. I like the way they put the second bullet here. You're engaging as strategic partners, not just reactive reviewers. And we've all been on those boards. I will admit, even in my role as consultant, I sit on boards and I have been this kind of board member too, where we just receive the information, maybe we give some advice back, but that's it. We want to be strategic partners. You all are on boards because you have some sort of unique perspective, skills, expertise, experience. So you can bring that to bear as a strategic partner. You can bring that voice and understanding and even what you're learning today as part of that strategic partnership. Then we get to that generative level. So once we have the good fiduciary oversight, we have that systematized, those processes in place, we understand our strategic role, we're even part of strategic planning, that then allows us to get into the generative insight. so that we're able to really analyze problems and sometimes those ambiguous situations. So often what happens in the nonprofit sector is not so cut and dried, easy to understand, and we have to be talking through a number of variables and potential outcomes and what it could mean for our organization. It also means that we're able to be much more adaptive as a board. We've got this strong strategic plan, this strategic footing that we're in. So then as your chief executive brings you new information, new scenarios, you're really able to react in real time and have that kind of generative discourse that is going to allow you to be a much more effective board and really a much more better partner for your chief executive. Having been a chief executive, that's the kind of board I always wanted. One where I could go in and say, here's what's happening in our real life. How can you be part of solving this with me? Okay, so we got a question in the chat. What is the liability with strategic oversight? I don't know that you have a liability as long as you're doing your fiduciary oversight initially first, right? That is your legal requirement. You have to do the fiduciary oversight no matter what. Once that is really locked down and you've got it kind of systematized, then you can throw in that next level of strategic oversight. It doesn't change your liability. It really just is a graduation of your board and its ability to govern properly.
Do you recommend BoardSource or the Colorado.gov to look at some of those more like in the weeds legal requirements for boards?
Yeah, and we do actually later in the slide deck, we do have a specific resource on generative insight for boards, generative governance, and strategy through BoardSource. If you are not on BoardSource, board members, let me turn you on to the best website for your lives, BoardSource. It's all one word, BoardSource. And they've got a ton of free resources. And then if you want, you can get, it's a pretty low cost membership and you get access to even more resources, but they've got a lot of just really practical guides that help you in this nonprofit context. So if you're sitting here and saying like, okay, Nia, that sounds amazing, but like, how do I do it? Don't worry, I'm here for you. First and foremost is really just having that conversation with your board. What is generative insight? When have we maybe even seen it coming up without being able to have identified in that moment that that's happening? You've probably done it at some point in your board service. It's also important to identify what type of governance you're providing. So as you're approving your budget, you can clearly say, all right, this is our fiduciary oversight being actually played out in real time. And then look for opportunities to practice these different types. Have it called out in your agenda that you're going to be providing strategic oversight. You're going to be reviewing your progress towards your strategic plan and give opportunities for that generative discussion. I think that's probably the most significant difference for most boards is to provide generative insight. You have to have room to discuss. That doesn't just happen with a quick vote. Yes, no, this is the way we need to go. Generative insight is done through discourse, and that's going to take time. And it's really going to take time as you're getting more comfortable in those spaces.
Yeah, and we're going to go into a little bit more of the details around some of the tweaks that you can make to just start to be able to introduce a space that is conducive for generative governance. I just want to say quickly, I think the hardest part of doing a webinar right next to you is we both like to talk with our hands and we're like very like careful to not smack each other in the face.
It'll be part of our blooper reel from today's webinar.
Yeah, right. So when we're looking at some of the things we can do, again, we're focusing on this high level, our vision, mission, values at a macro level. So we really want to be able to create space in our meetings, like Nia said, for discourse, to be able to have these discussions. If somebody has a disagreement, we want to flesh it out. We don't want to have to push that aside because we need to move on to the next topic. So consent agendas are really going to come in handy for this because then you can just get those kind of rubber stamp things out of the way with a consent agenda and you can move on to those bigger conversations where you're able to really prioritize what those important issues are to your board, staff, organization, and the community. We talked earlier, what are the community needs and opportunities that are going on? What are they raising to you? And how can we bring this up and discuss it in the boardroom? It also relies on really setting those expectations of our board members, current and new, right? So in our orientation process, if we're onboarding new people, we really make it clear to them that on this board, you're expected to read the board packet before you show up to the meeting. You're expected to do your homework before you get to class so that you can have a thoughtful and engaging discussion, because we don't want to spend 30 minutes catching Nia up on what we're talking about. And I remember being on a nonprofit, and we had a 2-day board retreat, and we were into the half of the second day, and I had a board member tell me, I think I finally understand what this organization does. Oh my God, could you imagine how different our board meetings and our work would have been if every board member felt like they had that level of understanding? I'm not saying like when they first come in, but after the first, few meetings, if they really had that understanding how more engaging and fruitful our board meetings and our work could have been.
I think a helpful indicator for any of you who are thinking about, okay, do we need to restructure our board meetings? Is it working or not? Think about how many voices you're hearing in an average board meeting. At one point when I was sitting on a board, I would take tallies. Oh, the board chair is speaking, the CEO is speaking, and it would just go back and forth between the two of them. That means the rest of us are basically there to do up, down, yes, no votes and not really have discussion. And sometimes it is just because of how we've structured it. We don't give time and space. We haven't moved the consent agenda items the way they should happen. So start taking note of that if you haven't, and this could be whether you're staff or a board member. How many voices are you hearing in the boardroom? If it's just a few, that's really an indicator that you're ready to restructure and make sure you've got time and space to hear from all of the people who are there for a reason. You want their voices heard. We just have to give them space.
Yep, and that leads beautifully into encouraging diverse perspectives. So if we're really focused on creating a diverse and inclusive board, part of what Nia said is making sure that everybody has a chance to speak and that their voices are being heard, that we're getting away from this kind of like yes man echo chamber that can happen when there's not enough diverse perspectives in the room. Again, because we don't always have to agree, but we have to have that space to have thoughtful discourse around it. And if we disagree, how are we moving forward? How are we able to, as a group, come to a place where there's some kind of compromise or agreement, or at least a way to move forward? I just touched on this a little bit already, where when we get to when our boards are too homogeneous, we get into this place where we don't want to be the one that's taking up time and saying the differing opinion, right? Because it's like, oh, shoot, we only have 10 minutes to discuss this, so I don't really want to bring it up because it's going to derail our whole meeting, right? It goes back to, again, why it's important to restructure our board meetings to give that space for conversation. And again, when we're bringing in different perspectives, whether it's with our staff, our partners, the communities that we are in or that we work with, we want to give them time and space to be heard and to have a discussion. We don't want them to feel like they're being tokenized on our board. And it's like, you're here, but you actually never get to talk because it's only the executive committee and the CEO that we're only ever hearing from. And what all of this diverse perspective and discourse does is allows us to see our work for what it really is. So we don't have our blinders on anymore, and how we can really thoughtfully and strategically move forward and with our mission, vision, values. And does that need to be tweaked? Can we still go for that North Star? Or how are we going to change it? Or how are we going to get there in a really thoughtful, inclusive way?
I just want to bring up an example of that second one that we had with a client recently. This organization was moving towards a pretty large construction project. They had already vetted through the options. They had this really grand plan for what was going to happen. And they talked to some donors about it and thought they had them lined up. And then we came in as, that neutral third party, and come to find out the donors were telling them what they wanted to hear, and the client was also hearing what they wanted to hear. So when we were able to come back with data and say, here's how much we actually think you can raise towards this campaign, here are the concerns we're hearing from the community, it allowed the board to have a really different level of discourse than just, making decisions on good vibes. right? We want to make those decisions on as much data as we can. And we were able to give that feedback differently.
I think you had
This is
the
me, sorry.
word, but I'm happy to take it.
No, that's fine. Okay, so chief executives. So when we're talking about how to shift our board meetings, shift our board discussions, here's some things for your chief executive, executive director, whatever you call them, to think about. First and foremost is making topics discussable. This can be as simple as just giving space to understand your programs and services better. It could mean actually bringing up more topics that you actually want true feedback on, not rubber stamp feedback, but true feedback. And it's important to know that distinction sometimes. Making sure that you're actually inviting dissent and sharing that leadership. When you've got too much power concentrated with one leader, it can really lead to some decisions that are made without a better context provided. So as chief executives, invite that dissent. Open that door for folks to bring up those differing opinions. And make sure that you're always balancing the governance partnership without thinking too much about what's happened in the past, which I know we can all fall into. We've tried that before. I don't want to do that. Or here are all the issues from our past. Let me bring this baggage to the table. And so, yes, we want to be informed by our history and not be too wedded to it as we're thinking about the future, because contexts change. We add staff. That means things can be done differently. And so we always want to make sure we've got a really balanced partnership. When we're thinking about the foundations for distributing that leadership, first and foremost has to be trust. And I think this is actually true beyond that, and making sure that we have a good partnership between our board chair, our entire board, and our chief executive. There has to be trust. You as board members, you come in maybe once a month, maybe once a quarter even, and you're not in the day-to-day. So even just by its sheer nature, you are trusting that your chief executive is there every day working towards your mission and making things happen. If you don't have that trusting relationship, you're not going to be able to make any higher level decisions. And there are a lot of things that you can do to make sure that you have a better trusting relationship, like transparency. The more your chief executive shares about what's happening, the more you can feel comfortable that the right things are happening. It's also important for folks to invest in learning, right? And even think about, as an organization, are you a truly learning organization? Are you growing? Are you integrating the latest and greatest that's happening in your field? We want to make sure that we actually have resources devoted to that for our staff, right? Are we really making sure that they can be as informed as possible as decision makers? Are we providing leadership training? Are we providing the stones so that folks can move up and have greater leadership within the organization? So that learning piece allows us to have more distributed leadership within our staff teams. So again, not everything's not concentrated with our chief executive. And when we're talking about implementing shared practices, there are a few things that we can be doing. First and foremost is embracing autonomy, which can sound a little backwards, right? So shared leadership means we're all coming together, right? We're sharing everything. Well, autonomy is also really helpful because as decisions are being made, we don't have to have so much control at the top, and people can really figure out what's the best way to execute this. How can I implement this in my role that makes the most sense for what I know the best? Because I'm doing it all day, every day. We want to make sure that there's always buy-in across the full organization. Like we talked about with strategic planning early on, actually involving board and staff together in your strategic planning creates that buy-in and then makes shared leadership that much easier. I mentioned transparency once, I'm going to mention it again. The more we can share information, the more we can be transparent in both directions, the better. We were just working with an organization on some strategic planning and realized that there were some pretty significant gaps in understanding on both sides. And it was never malicious. It was nobody's intent. It was just pretty clear that because of a variety of instances, the staff hadn't realized some of the decisions the board had made. The board didn't have the full context of what was going on with the staff. And so we actually started off the strategic planning retreat, just having this coming together and sharing of information so that we could all get on the same page before having to make some pretty significant joint decisions. And then always clarifying roles. So even when we're sharing leadership, we want to make sure that we've got clarity so that there isn't this feeling of stepping on toes, that we know that things are going to be done because we've really defined responsibilities and accountability, and we know that we're being as effective as possible. Is this me too?
I can take it.
No, it's fine.
Okay, I don't remember, to be honest, so.
This is why we don't do this on shared computers normally. So, indicators of success. And to be clear, either of us can take this because this is the stuff we talk about all day, every day. We love this work. So you have started working towards distributed leadership, shared leadership, some form of that. How do you know what's happening? First and foremost is making sure that decision-making is actually happening at every level. If you're still finding that the board is making the ultimate decision on everything, you probably haven't properly distributed it. You should start to see better innovation and better idea generation, right? Because now you're saying everybody at the table has an opportunity to be part of solving this. That allows so many more ideas, so many more brains to help think about the problems you have, and it's going to lead to real innovation. You're going to see people taking greater responsibility and responsiveness, right? As things are coming up, they're able to step in and adapt and address them much sooner. And you're also going to see just more diverse representation, communication externally, making sure that what's happening is really shared beyond those walls of those boardrooms. And of course, most importantly, it's going to have an impact on your mission related outcomes, right? That is why we do anything differently, is because we want to see our mission fulfilled to the greater extent possible. As we're working towards distributed leadership, we should also be coming up with indicators that are really unique to our own organizations, right? You might have some really critical decision-making processes that you're trying to address. Make sure you've identified how you're measuring success so that you can make sure that it's really actually working.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
I said it before, but just to reemphasize, I know it's not feasible for all of your staff to attend every board meeting, but if you're walking down the street and one of your board members walks past you and doesn't realize that you're a staff member at the organization where they're a board, that's a problem, right? So an indicator of success would be that the board knows the staff, right? They know who you are. They know the work that you're doing. Maybe it's a rotating kind of thing where every department sends a staff person to come in and talk about the work that's been doing and share a mission moment, right? So that everybody is kind of getting this face time and relationships are being able to be strengthened and built. And I was going to say, we've encountered boards that feel like they need to approve every email that's going out, every social that's going out. And that's not the kind of level, right? We want the board to be up here as a strategic tool, right? They're looking at that long-term mission, vision, values, and they're the strategic arm of an organization, that real governance piece living in that space. But times that there are staff that need to come in and help shape decisions too. So I worked for an organization where we didn't have a family leave policy at all. And so staff was coming into board meetings, some of us for the first time, having this conversation. And I'm glad that we were there, because some of the board members were talking about, well, what if members of the fundraising team planned out when they were going to get pregnant so that they did not have their children during the peak fundraising season at the end of the year? And some of these comments were coming from board members that I knew and I respected and had a lot of great work with in the past. And then I sit in this board meeting, I'm like, okay, this is important. This is why we're here, right? To have this discourse and work through to get to a family leave policy that works for everybody.
Well, and I would say probably in that example too, by having your staff voice in those discussions, that's already helping to distribute the leadership, right? It's not just your chief executive in that room, trying to advocate for something. It's bringing all those voices. And I have to say, as a board member, I always loved that. Like seeing the people who are so passionate about the work we're doing that they have committed their careers for it. It just was so heartwarming. So I also found it way more fulfilling to have much more of a distributed leadership model as a board member. Okay, so challenges. We can talk about the benefits all day, but it's important to recognize there will be challenges if you want to make some of these shifts as you're becoming a more strategic, generative board. It means that you might have to get some additional support, right? It is this constant balancing act of having a more directive, kind of the traditional board model or even staff leadership model that is directive, where they say, here are the decisions, here's how it's going to move forward, to that participatory model. And it can't all happen overnight. You can't show up to your next board meeting and say, hey, we're going to shared leadership, let's go. Right? You need to continue to model it and move that shift. It's always also important to think about accountability. So how do we make sure we have leadership just around this change in a new leadership model? How do we make sure we've got responsibility appropriately designated? And making sure that we are giving time so that we can be nimble as needed, but also that we've got some expectations around response times and better informed decisions. So we're really bringing those voices to bear.
So we wanted to share a few case studies with you all. These are fully fleshed out. At the end, we have a resource slide in the Building Movement Projects Structuring Leadership document. But these are 3 organizations that have put either that dispersed leadership or shared leadership model into practice. And so we go to the next one, Make the Road, New York. And they actually had a 3 leadership, so 3 executive director structure. And they really saw the increase, their indicators of success were the increase in high staff retention and engagement. But always there are challenges, right? And so it's balancing that mutual responsibility and then managing the staff burnout, because as we've talked about, you have to have more transparency and more communication with these different types of leadership models. And that means a lot of meetings, right? So it can lead to a higher level of burnout. But we will go to the next slide. And this Compass Point Nonprofit Services was interesting to me because they attempted, and are still attempting, a distributed leadership model with program autonomy. And this came about because of the staff board partnership that happened when they were working on an organizational theory of change. And they carried that work throughout, not just from that one project, but it carried over throughout the rest of their work in their organization. I think, yeah, okay, we'll move on because I'm also being aware of our time. This one was the most interesting to me because it's so specific to the type of work that Urban Justice Center does. But basically what they have is they have different project directors that are expected to fundraise and then for their own work that they want to do. And then they have free reign basically to do whatever they want to do, whatever kind of clients they want to do, the type of work they want to take on, that kind of thing, who they want to hire, etc. But what they're lawyers that are working with different clients, so they're able to have their own little pots of money and fundraise for. So I don't know how applicable it is widely, but I think it's an interesting case study in that they really took their mission, vision, values, and the work that they do, and they applied a leadership model that works for them. They're like, this top-down thing isn't going to work for us, but this model where we're fundraising, each project director is fundraising for our own work and then getting this level of autonomy works for them.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second because, again, that was a ton of info. We're talking about totally new models of doing leadership. You might have some questions. So I just want to pause and see if anything's coming up for you, anything you want to talk through. Okay, it looks like folks are just taking it all in. That's fine. That's fine. We're available after this. When you sleep on it and tomorrow morning wake up with all the questions, we'll be here. Okay, so we're thinking about moving forward with generative governance. So you got your strategic plan, you're working on distributed leadership. How are we moving this forward? Again, we're going to talk about mutual commitment. This can't just be a board decision. This can't just be a staff decision. It has to truly be mutual, that you want to shift, that you want to have this greater agility. You're going to want to really have those internal conversations with the board about what is your best path? What are the steps you are very specifically going to take towards this? It can start off as easy as thinking about your agendas, right? We talked about that consent agenda piece. So trying to make it into these smaller bite-sized pieces. It's also helpful to just think about, okay, what are we doing this for, right? Like continue to remind ourselves that any kind of shifts in leadership model is about having better meetings, having higher level thinking, and ultimately a stronger organization. That is what we want. As we're thinking about these alternative leadership models, it's important to always think about the ultimate impact of our nonprofit. The best, most effective boards have the ability to truly shift the ability, the scope, the scale of impact of a nonprofit. And those are the ones that are much more generative than just providing fiduciary oversight. That emphasis on trust, learning, right, kind of continually growing and being willing to adapt, having those shared values and patience, those have to be foundational and fundamental when starting this. As you're moving towards adopting strategic plans, getting into more generative thinking, you're able to see then how innovation can take shape, how we're getting to that next level of an organization. And the fact that the board members who are on this call, you're even here, indicates that you're wanting to learn and grow and be better board members. So you can be on the forefront of helping make these shifts so that your board can be better functioning. As Megan mentioned, we have some resources here. So a lot of our content, especially when it comes to the generative governance principles and structured leadership, come from these 2 articles where you can read a lot more about it. You can also reach out to us always. Our info is here. When you'll get a follow-up email from Elevations where you can also request the slides, so you can do that. But we're here for you, first off, for the next 14 minutes, but also after today, if you have follow-up questions or need resources.
I think the one kind of in between the lines throughout this whole presentation that we could spend a whole other presentation on is it matters who you recruit to your board. Because if we're talking about having these robust discussions with the diverse perspectives, if we're talking about really being able to move our vision forward, then it matters who's at the table in the room having those discussions.
Yeah. What questions?
Yeah, I think that Christine here, that's what just keeps going through my mind is, having an organization that has truly been successful for the period of time that they've been in existence, but just a huge shift, looking to the future and respecting and revering the past. But yeah, change is hard, and how you move into a space of change management, and respecting that past, but knowing that you need to do things differently. And so much is ingrained in something as simple as how board meetings run. That's what I was just thinking is, how you move into having dialogue and discussions and brainstorming in a healthy way versus what a board has been used to for years. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one. So just I don't really have a question, just a comment of everything that you've shared with us about how you mindfully make changes.
Yeah. Well, and you're exactly right. It truly is a change management process. I mean, your board can sit there and everybody can agree, like, yes, we need to make these changes. We want things to be different. And when the rubber meets the road of those changes happening, you can still end up with pushback and hurt feelings. I mean, I think you hit on a really good point there too, of like really honoring the past and the work that has been done is so important as we continue to look towards the future and potentially a new path.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Christine. Other thoughts, questions? Okay. Well, then I'll just say again, thank you all so much. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to hand it back to Jen with Elevations.
Nia and Megan, thank you so much. This is so great information. We will be sending out the recording so you can go back and read through all the gems they had to share with us today. And so you'll get an email from Elevations within the next day or two with the link to the recording. And then, as Nia said, you can request the slides as well. And there is a survey, so we'd love to hear feedback about this presentation or any future topics you'd love for us to cover down the road. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.